As you know, our presentation today is getting to know Toronto and all of its biodiversity.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. So at the start, we always do a little land acknowledgement for the Indigenous people who were originally on this land who continue to be here. So I just want to say High Park is the ancestral land of many nations, including the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We acknowledge that the abundance of High Park today is a result of continuous Indigenous caretaking and stewardship for thousands of years. Each time we step into any of the three ecosystems in High Park, we witness a myriad of interactions between the animals, fungi, and plants that call them home. So this is just a little overview of what we're going to talk about in our presentation. So we'll start with an icebreaker, nature in your neighborhood, we'll introduce ourselves, all that stuff. Next, we'll go into biodiversity and just all the aspects of it. Then we'll go into the glacial history of Toronto. Next, we'll do shaping Toronto, rivers and wetlands. Then we'll move into the forests. And then we'll talk about the three specific ecosystems that are in High Park. And then finally, we'll end off with how you can help, what you can do to protect biodiversity. Yeah. So here is kind of the science definition of biodiversity. So biodiversity is the variety of life found in a place on Earth. So it could be all of Earth, it could be just an ecosystem. It's very vague. It is often used to describe the total variety of life on all of Earth. And it encompasses three different aspects. So genetic variation within a species, the numbers and kinds of living organisms in an area, and then the variety of habitats, communities, and ecological processes that occur in the biosphere or kind of the living realm. Just shown over in my little diagram.
Beautiful.
So this is just on how we measure biodiversity because there are so many different ways. So one of the basic and kind of one you probably think about is genetic diversity. So that's measuring the variations in DNA sequences in individuals from the same species. So that's figuring out, how many of our squirrels are going to be gray versus black versus brown, that kind of thing. And then there's two measures for species. There's richness, which is the number of different species, and then evenness, which is the relative abundance of different species within a community. So for this one, I like to use the example of walking through a forest. Yeah. And so you're walking through a forest of 100 trees, and both of these forests happen to have the same 4 tree species, maple, oak, pine, and poplar, say. But one of those forests, there's 25 of each of those 4 tree species. And then in the next one, it's, say, 97 maples, and then just one of the other 4 options, or one of the other 3 options. They have the same richness, which means there's the same number of different species, but their evenness is completely different. And then the last one is ecosystem diversity, which is the different types of habitats present in an area.
Yeah, and all of these, when one becomes a little bit off balance from the others, can lead to challenging spaces, challenging conditions when it comes to survivability. So genetic diversity, this often gets talked about when we're at a point in a species, evenness, relative abundance, how many of them exist, because when you have a very small population, you have less genetic diversity, and that creates a condition or a space where you're more likely, if something were to occur, you don't have that same resiliency. Diseases become more prevalent. If there's ever a change in the climate condition, you might not have the adaptations to help survive with that. Genetic diversity just helps allocate, maybe not allocate, so I word, create a space where you have these DNA mutations that allow for that evolution to occur, allow for people to, different individuals, different organisms to survive better. Same things with richness and evenness. That all has to do with like making sure that we have enough food for each species. So in Katy's examples of the trees, certain trees have incredibly high biodiversity, like our oak trees. They support 400 different invertebrates. When you're in a space where we would typically want to have those keystone species that have those types of supports, even making sure that there's more, those trees provides more food. keeps making sure that you can have like a overall diverse space. And the same thing too with ecosystems diversity. Kay is definitely going to speak about this in more detail future. But when you have overlapping ecosystems next to each other, you can just support more diverse species because all of their needs are met. They're being able to find shelter and food and spaces that they'll need to be able to continue their life cycle.
All right, and now we'll move on to the relationships that happen in ecosystems. And every single thing comes back to the geology and climate, which are what we call abiotic features, so things that aren't alive. So the bedrock will influence the kind of soil that you're growing your plants in, same with the temperature and the precipitation. So that, yeah, that leads into our plant communities. So you'll get different species of plants and different composition of plants depending on your soil. And then your plants, of course, feed your invertebrates and some vertebrates, but in this case, they feed your invertebrates. So again, different plants are hosts for different species of invertebrates. And then different invertebrates are different prey species for vertebrates, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, all of that fun stuff. So yeah, all of the biotic or living factors kind of rely on those abiotic, not alive factors of climate and geology. Yeah. And of course, we probably all know about our food web. This is kind of, it's a little bit, but I like this picture because it broke it down really well.
Yeah.
So it's got your soil, your nutrients and water, plus the sun energy to grow your producers or your plants, which in this case is an oak tree.
Mm-hmm. Those would be our abiotics that we mentioned before. The building blocks, really like the foundations of life.
Yeah. And then from the producers, we have our primary consumers who are often small mammals and birds as well as invertebrates. So those are going to be either eating the tree leaves directly or they're going to be eating the seeds and nuts from that tree. And then we'll move up to our secondary consumers who consume our primary consumers. And then so on and so forth. Tertiary consumers consume our secondaries. But as you can see here, the tertiary consumers can also consume primary consumers. There's nothing, there's nothing stopping our wolf from eating a field mouse instead of a frog. It's just they're up here because they can eat those bigger secondary consumers like a raccoon.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then on the right side in the blue and orange box are kind of like what happens after our consumers die.
Yeah.
So our detritivores, they eat the meat. So they wouldn't be eating our decomposing tree. They would eat our animals. And then decomposers, they will decompose absolutely everything. Logs, frogs, bears,
you name
anything that's alive, the decomposers will eat it. All right, so this is just a little recap of what we learned in that first little bit.
This is very much just to make sure that we're all on the same level playing field when we go into talking about Toronto. So you just want to make sure that we are all on the same page when it comes to definitions of biodiversity, the impact of climate and geology when it comes into plant communities, the influences of those plant communities onto invertebrates, and then the relationships that we have between primary and secondary consumers, as well as our favorites, detritivores, because we all love those hawks, or not hawks, my apologies, turkey vultures as they come through the city. They're like, yeah, the most unspring-like spring migratory bird. But yeah, so before we move on to like really, all right, there we go, biodiversity in Toronto. Yeah.
So, setting the stage with our giant sheet of ice. Approximately 20,000 years ago, Toronto was under a 2-kilometer thick ice sheet, which is, I don't know, it's some like 6 CN Towers on top of each other or something crazy like that. And then over about 8,000 years, it receded to form early Lake Iroquois, which was very big. And then as this ice sheet receded further, Lake Iroquois drained either south or north into the St. Lawrence River, leaving behind Lake Ontario.
Yeah, so you can see here on the illustration what is indicated in blue. That would have been the boundaries of Lake Iroquois, and then you can see the lines underneath of what's currently Lake Ontario today. If anyone has spent time at Casa Loma or in the Annex, There's a set of stairs that go from Davenport Road up to Casa Loma. That is the former shoreline for Lake Iroquois. So that set of stairs, that's the escarpment of where the lake used to be, which is pretty cool. And then, oh no, and then part of that too, if you spend any time digging in Toronto soils, this type of environment here creates that depository environment that allows those soils to form. So that sandy soil, that clay soil, that slow moving water really creates that space.
And speaking of soil, we got a little spoiler of this,
Yeah.
but this is just all about how soil is formed, and it's got a very fancy name called pedogenesis, which I love. And this is just our recipe. So the first thing we need is mineral parent material, which would be either like solid bedrock or just bigger rocks. The second is organic matter, so that's leaves, dead plant matter, even bits of dead animals. The third is water. Fourth is wind, and the fifth is so much time.
Yeah.
And then after all that, you've got soil. And here are just some of the processes that that parent material goes through to become soil. So weathering is the actual physical breaking down of rocks and minerals. And then erosion is when they're worn away and transported somewhere else. People often get these mixed up. They think weathering and erosion are kind of the same thing, but erosion is actually the transport of those sediments to another location. And then deposition is once those are carried somewhere else, they get dropped wherever they are. Fourth, organic matter accumulation. That's just once you've got your layer of mineral soil underneath, you've got all your dead things falling on top. Soil mixing happens with a lot of invertebrates. So there's an entire soil food web of all the invertebrates in the soil. So it would mostly be worms mixing your soil around. And then soil development is just kind of like it's fermenting almost. It's sitting there hanging out. You've got soil, but it just needs to keep mixing, and the animals need to keep doing their thing in the soil.
That's where time really comes in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Now we're getting down into Toronto's soils. I've zoomed in a little bit. This was a really, really big map from like the west side of Mississauga all the way to like the east end of Scarborough. So I zoomed in a little bit to make it more clear. So there are a bunch of deposit sources. I think that the biggest ones that we have in this area are from the glacial lakes, which are in like
the yellow.
Yeah, in the yellow.
Yellow and red.
And orange. There's not orange, blue.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the different colors are just kind of like different sources, different lake sources, or different depths. So there are different colors for Lake Iroquois because where there's deeper water, there would be different sediments than when there was shallow water.
Yeah, the slower water is, the smaller the particulates can be that fall out of it. So if we're thinking about where High Park is, our water would have been, we have sand predominantly. So that means that there was still quite a bit of movement because sand is surprisingly a larger.
It's big.
It's big. It's chunky. You can easily feel those pieces. It's gritty. So that's actually a faster moving environment. And you can see that like where we are, we're in the yellow area. So that would have been deposited in the shoreline. So shallow water still has a little bit of movement to it, lots of sand, and there is a little bit of siltiness in there as well. But again, sand's that major component. If you spend time out in Ashbridges Bay or near where they have the Evergreen brickworks or any places where we would have had those clay quarries in the past, those are environments that would have been more of a lagoon, even slower water, very not moving around very much because that allowed that clay to kind of fall out. So places where you have in the blue, I believe, those are kind of like a mix of like pond environments, environments where you would have had very slow moving water to allow that clay to fall out. Areas of the city where you have more sandy soil, more silty soil, like we have here in High Park, a little bit faster moving water, still a little bit movement, but that allowed it to fall out. And then I think we'll get into this a little bit more, but that really kind of like leads into like where we're going to have different types of plant matter, because that relationship between clay sizes, sand sizes, and gravel sizes allow for there to be different space within that soil structure. That enables water to be held in different ways. Different plants like different amounts of water. That allows for air to exist in different ways. So all that structure of the soil, the spaces between those different types of soil particles makes it more hospitable to certain types of plants.
Okay. And now these are just some examples of where you can find different soil types throughout the city. So sand, of course, the beaches. It's a beach. There's going to be sand, Etobicoke in the west, and then also East York, which I thought was surprising because Etobicoke and East York, two different,
very different spots. Yeah.
Yeah. But so the plants here would need to be heat and drought tolerant with deep root systems because, as Aira was saying, the sand is pretty big particles. Like they don't look big, but in terms of soil, they are.
Yeah.
So when they sit together, my hands aren't the best, but when they sit together, they leave big gaps in between that let the water go right through, so it doesn't hold on to it very well. So yeah, these plants are very well adapted for that. And then wetland soils you can find in the Humber Valley, the Grenadier Pond, and really any of Toronto's ravines, because those are lower lying areas. Plants need to have like having wet feet, which means that they can kind of handle really wet, saturated soils without dying because the soils are clay and silt dominated. And they have very, very poor drainage, which is how wetlands are formed. If they had good drainage, there would be no water in our wetland to make it. So yeah.
Yeah, so clay is really, really tiny particles. And the neat thing about clay too is that it's chemically or physically chemically quite different because it actually will attract water and hold water in a space as well, just because it's so little.
And they're shaped like plates actually, so they sit on top of each other instead of kind of fitting together in circles.
Yeah, so you're going to have plants here that aren't going to have like a very deep root system, a little bit more shallow. Oftentimes they'll actually kind of like run out rather than down, like they're more spread out across. And like Katy was saying, having that wet feet, like they really want to be in water. Some plants will drown, they don't like that at all. They really want like dry, arid environments, but others really want wet.
And some plants are so adapted to wetlands actually that they're floating plants. They don't actually make roots into the soil at all. They just float on the surface and put their little roots out into the water and get everything that they need.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Before we move on, does anyone have any final questions about soil and plants and how that relationship works? Does anyone have questions about how to figure out what kind of soil that they have? We can also do that.
Oh yeah, we can do that on Thursday.
We'll be doing that on Thursday, so we can kind of interact with the soil because we're lucky. We'll get into this a little bit more, but we do actually have different types, all three types of soil in the pack. So we can actually kind of like interact with some soil and see how it feels differently in our hands. So we can actually understand like, yes, this is sand, this is silty. Cool. All right.
All right. So now we're getting into the forests, the trees, but not our street trees. Those are not the ones we are talking about right now. Toronto is in the Carolinian forest region, also called the deciduous forest region. It's the smallest forest region in Canada. And some plants found in Toronto you can't find like even half an hour north of here. So it's a super, super interesting ecosystem. Oh, now we're talking about succession. So you may have heard this word before, succession, but ecological succession is a gradual process by which species composition change in an ecological community over time. And as you can see in the two photos, there are two main kind of modes of succession. Primary succession, where there was absolutely nothing on that, like in that area before. And you're basically starting from, you've got boulders, and now we have to develop our soil, slowly develop it, finally get some organic matter. So it's a very, very, very slow process. And then secondary succession means that there was an ecosystem like a forest or something there, and there's been a disturbance. So that could be a fire, a tornado, like usually a natural disaster, but it could also be clear cutting. That means that the ecosystem has to start again, but not start from rocks.
Yeah, and Toronto has interestingly gone through both of these types of successions. So at one point, we wouldn't have had many, if any, plants after the glaciers moved through this space. Once the glaciers moved through, we would have gone through each of these forest types. So if we think about the Hudson Bay lowlands, that's very much you're kind of almost nearly above the tree line at that point. There's lots of moss and lichen. Those plants help weather and break down that rock material to start creating the forest, or sorry, soil for a forest to grow in. So as those glaciers went up, we're actually still technically in the rebound after the last ice age, which is kind of pretty cool. So as those glaciers started to recede, we would have those early structured plants coming in, helping to develop the soil floor, so that we would have the forest, which would have been the boreal, eventually the Great Lakes, and now what we have today, the deciduous forest. So we've seen that change with climate and then soil development over time through this space. So that primary succession has happened here in Toronto. And then what we see more frequently now is our secondary succession, where urban development and in some cases fires have changed Toronto, that we're seeing different plant communities come in through different areas of the city over time.
Yeah. So depending on the kind of stage of succession that you're in, your species composition will be different, because there are your trees that are called early succession trees and then late succession trees. And the characteristics of an early succession tree is that they really need sunlight. Like they don't really do very well with shade or being crowded out by competition, which is why they tend to die off as the forest grows into those bigger, more dominant, I think maples are a late succession.
Yeah.
Oaks, those bigger trees that can do with a little more shade, or they just grow faster to get to the top of the canopy before everybody else does. Yeah. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit more about the Carolinian forest. So as I mentioned, it's the smallest forest region in Canada. It's 1% of Canada's landmass, but it's actually 3% of Ontario's area. So we've got quite a good chunk of this tiny forest region. Despite being the smallest forest region, it supports the largest number of native tree species of any of the region. And it also supports approximately 25% of Canada's species at risk, many of whom are at their northern limit of their range. So if they went any further north, it would be too cold for them to live. Some examples are the sassafras, which isn't, I don't believe, a species at risk.
Not that I'm aware of.
But it is an indicator species of Carolinian forest. The cucumber tree, American chestnut, hop tree, and red mulberry, those are all species at risk in Canada. And then some animals, we've got the American badger, the Canada warbler, the Jefferson salamander, which is one of my personal favorites, and the monarch butterfly, which I know we've been doing a lot of work to, I don't know if reintroduce is the right word, but like get their population numbers up. And then our next one is the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest region, which is just north of us. It's the second largest forest region in Ontario, being approximately 20% of our area. It's a very wide forest region, stretching from southeastern Manitoba all the way to the Gaspé Peninsula in Quebec. It's somewhat of a transition zone between the southern deciduous Carolinian forests and the coniferous boreal forests further north. And it's dominated by uneven aged hardwood forest, which means that all the trees aren't the same age, which is actually really, really good for forests. We like when they're unevenly aged. Yeah. And some common plants are species of hemlock, maple, oak, red and white pine, and yellow birch. Yeah. And then the animals are we're getting into kind of our bigger mammals now. So our black bears, our white-tailed deers, our moose, and our pileated woodpecker, which is one of my favorite woodpecker species because they're massive. Yeah.
Rosie? Oh, no.
We've still got like half a presentation left.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah, so now we're going to introduce you to Toronto's, I'm just trying to put it in the right place, Toronto's ravines and watersheds. So
the green areas here indicate the protected ravines that we have here in Toronto. One of the benefits of the city, going back to the glacial times, we have another map as well to kind of show some of the wetlands and some of the rivers existing in the space, is that these ravines would have been carved out as those glacier waters would have come off of those glaciers further north of the city. They would have drained into Lake Iroquois and eventually Lake Ontario. And when they carved out these really steep, oh, perfect. So when they carved off these really, really steep areas, it made it incredibly difficult to develop, which is kind of to the benefit of where we are today, because this is where the majority of our environmentally sensitive areas are found in the city of Toronto. About 20%, I think it's actually 17 to be precise, of the city is covered in these ravine spaces, and that allows us to have a relatively green city considering how dense and how fast growing we are as a city itself. So again, limited development in this kind of spaces where we find a lot of our endangered species in Toronto, where we find a lot of our sensitive habitats, including wetland spaces, spaces like High Park, where it makes it very challenging to build houses. Also, they're mostly all in floodplains as well too. So it's one of the benefits that we have having these ravines here.
There's our map.
Perfect. Thank you. So this is one, and we'll also transition over.
Yeah, we'll transition over to.
We just stopped sharing our screen, but what we're going to do is we're going to pull up an interactive map from Lost Rivers Toronto. Lost Rivers Toronto is a fabulous nonprofit organization that's done a lot of research and work towards mapping the existing waterways that we have here in Toronto.
So all the way up to 1802, which is that first map that you saw in the presentation.
Yeah, so this is the city of Toronto has changed a lot over time. If you're moving around, let's say the Christie Pitts environment, Little Portugal, you're often going to see signs for Garrison Creek. If you're in the annex, maybe Tattle Creek. These are all historical rivers that have over time been channeled underground or buried. Christie Pitts Park, Brickford Park are other examples where those really deep pits would have been waterways in the past. The bowl at Trinity Bellwoods, I believe, also would have been a waterway in the past. So one of the benefits or one of the influences that this has on Toronto biodiversity, if we go back to the soils and we go back to the glaciers carved out these spaces that have created environments that we currently cannot develop in the ravine system. And they've also created spaces where we're going to have soils that are more clay, more silty, leading to spaces that have different plant communities compared to somewhere that's like a tablelands, a flatter area beside it, where we're going to have more sandy soils from that existing ravine, or sorry, from that glacier lake depositional environment. So you can see where we have all these little lines here. These are historical rivers that have existed. They've created spaces, a depositional and a soil environment that are different from the spaces directly beside it. So it's going to allow for this patchwork-like environment when it comes to soils. When you have different types of soils very close to each other, going back to the initial slide that Katy had about the richness and evenness and abundance, we're going to have a lot of abundance of different species in a very small area, because we can have a diverse plant community because we have soils that were deposited in a river environment, soils that were deposited in an environment that would have been a little bit more of a sandy space created from the lake historically way back. So it's really neat that we have this richness and diversity in plant communities because we've had these existing past waterways. Yeah, so Katie's just going to run us through this to kind of see over time how the city has changed when it comes to like our river spaces. So we're starting to see as the city begins to grow that we're losing our rivers and our waterways as they get channeled underground.
Especially downtown.
Especially
what
downtown.
I noticed.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, there they go.
Yep.
All right, and then this one I believe is 1950.
Yeah, so that's our most recent map.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
compare that to, you can click on the PowerPoint.
Can I go like back to here? Yeah, so oh sorry, I'll let you drive it.
No, but like if you go, yeah, so that compared to this map. So this one here, all those blue bits are those blue bits in there.
Yeah.
And everything else, all of those other colors have been buried and aren't visible aerially anymore. Yeah, so, and it was a pretty quick timeline for them to disappear too, because like there's 1910, so that's 40 years. It went from this to that.
Yeah.
And yeah, in the geologic time, 40 years is like the blink of an eye.
Yeah.
Yes, it's just it all happens so fast.
And where we still have those waterways existing today are a lifeline for a lot of different animals that we have in the city. So we have several species of turtles, some of which are endangered that rely on these waterways. We also have salamanders and amphibians, a variety of different frogs that do rely on these spaces as well. And we have there's 50 million birds that move through Toronto alone during the migration period, and all of them require water to some degree. It doesn't necessarily need to be waterfowl. Every single bird needs to drink. So these waterways become incredibly important for different plants and animals. Cool.
Yeah.
All right. So we have a message in the chat. So we're just going to take a look at that and then we'll move back into the. What are, so I think, Henry, can you maybe explain this? Yeah, fish species as well. Yeah, 100%, especially our salmon that are kind of endangered now in this environment. But so Henry, just kind of looking for some clarity. It's like, so what are environmental relationships on wildlife to think of? So do you mean like the environmental relationships between wetlands and different animals, or in general?
Like different animals? In general.
Oh, okay. So we'll get into this a little bit further, especially when we talks about like how we can think about protecting these animals. But the biggest thing to think about when it comes to conserving animals or conserving spaces for animals to exist in for wildlife protection is to think about what those animals need. So every single animal, any living organism, is going to need food and shelter, spaces for them to breed, things like that, like all those like key basics. So if you're thinking about, like, let's say, for example, we want to protect the piping plover. Piping plover is an endangered bird. It's a migratory bird. It is present within the Great Lakes ecosystem. The smallest population of the piping plover is in the Great Lakes. They do nest on Hanlands, which is on the Toronto Islands. It's a beach on the Toronto Islands. So those birds, when you're thinking about their ecosystem, you're going to want to make sure that they have what they need to eat, which is often invertebrates in the soil. So we want to make sure that the water in and around Hanlan's Point is as clean as it can possibly be, because we want to make sure that those invertebrates have a healthy environment to live in, that those insects can live. If we have those insects, then we have a food source for the piping plover. When the piping plover is breeding, they want to make sure that they can find a space where they themselves can be protected as a breeding parent, and their chicks as well as they're growing up. For them, they're looking for beaches where there's lots of pebbles, there's lots of driftwood. So they have spaces where, as they're raising their nests, while they're nesting, they can be camouflaged within the environment. That bird has like a really gray back, so we want to make sure that they can kind of like hide out among the rocks. And then we also want to make sure like predators are also really important. So like sometimes maybe make sure that we're not letting our cats and dogs outside to help protect them, have one fewer predator to face when they're out there, especially introduce predators like dogs and cats that aren't normal to this environment. So when we're thinking about our relationships with those animals, or like the ecological relationships between animals and the spaces around them, it's important to kind of think about that whole web, like we were looking at earlier, what's impacting everything lower down the food chain, including the climate, including abiotic factors like the soil. Cool. Excellent. Okay, so we are going to, we got another note from the chat. Okay. Oh, no, I didn't. Yeah, cool. Just make sure I think, yeah, everyone should be able to see our presentation.
I think so, yeah. I'm still screen share.
Good.
Okay. Oh my gosh, every time. There we go. now we can get into High Park's ecosystem.
Yes. Is everyone, so we kind of like,
We're a little behind on time.
yeah, we're a little behind on time, but does anyone need a bio break? Does anyone want to take a few minutes just to step away from the presentation, maybe, or get a drink or use the facilities, or are we good to keep going?
I think if we hear no response, we can assume we're good to keep going.
Yeah, okay, let's see what we got here. Okay.
All right.
So it seems like Henry's okay if we keep going, so.
Yeah.
All right. Oh, sorry.
That's okay. There. So the ecosystems in Hyde Park are combinations of wetlands, forests, and black oak savanna. This is just kind of a map of the park. I can annotate this. So of course our wetlands are in and around our body of water.
Known as the Hyde Park Wetland Complex. They're all together as you can just take this whole thing down here. So this is all kind of looked at as like one giant complex because they do have relation to each other. So the changes in Hyde Park that we see. So if we were to look at the water, the Lost Rivers map, we're noticing that the waterways would have extended further north across Bloor Street. They have all been channeled underground and are currently a part of the Toronto stormwater system. Even though a lot of the infrastructure here in Hyde Park, even these more natural ponds and rivers are considered part of stormwater management, they're still incredibly important ecosystems for a lot of animals and plants that rely on wetland environments.
Then our savannas, we've got a little chunk up here. It's our Bloor savanna. And it's down here.
Yep. So this is our Katy savanna. And we have, yep. So the tableland, I use this word a couple times. So tableland just means it's a flatter, more elevated space in Hyde Park compared to our ravine environments, which are also a little bit deeper. We got a little bit of savanna over here. And we also have a bit of savanna on the side of Hyde Park.
Yes.
Yeah.
I realized that color is exactly the same color that they used on the map.
Yeah, apologies there. And we also have forest ecosystems as well in Hyde Park. And our green, yeah. Yeah, so we're using bright greens to kind of highlight where we have some more forest ecosystems. So when we, just to go through, so the big difference between forests and savanna is the amount of sunlight that kind of comes through the space. Forest ecosystems are really densely populated with trees, so there's not a lot of sunlight that gets through the canopy to the forest floor. Comparatively, a black oak savanna, the dominant tree species is black oak. That's why it's been named that. And it's there's quite a bit of distance between each tree. So only about 20 to 30% of that area has a tree canopy cover. So it is covered by leaves. It's going to be shaded. The majority of that space is actually open to the air. So you have lots of sunlight that can get down, and that creates a really complex understory where we have lots of sun-loving wildflowers and sun-loving wild grasses as well.
So, my annotations are still there. I thought they would go away, but
Been covered?
Oh, maybe. There we go. But this is just kind of returning back to our concept of our food web and the fact that the type of soil we have impacts the kind of plants that can grow, which in turn influences the animal communities, both invertebrates and vertebrates. And we'll get into a couple of examples
of how we see that play out in Hyde Park. And again, Hyde Park's only about 400 acres. Like, it's a fairly small environment, but because of the proximity of these different ecosystems next to each other, as you were seeing in Katy's annotated maps, we had forests on the edges of wetlands, and those are both on the edges of savannas. We have all of these relationships that we talked about at like a city scale, even like an Ontario level scale, playing out within a 400-acre park. There's lots of rivers, there's lots of streams in Toronto that would have had a more, well, before they were buried, that would have had a more present life within the communities. So if you go back a couple hundred years, all of those diverse rivers would have been sources for water for communities. for like even not that long ago, there was areas of Toronto that still would have been farms, and those rivers would have fed those farms. They would have been a lifeline to a lot of early communities with the city. So it makes sense that those names would still be present in a lot of the surface levels happenings because historically those little rivers were key to those early settlers within the city and including the indigenous community as well. Um, any sort of old-timey map showing the changes in a community over time, those settlements are often around rivers because they wouldn't have had the electricity to pump water. They wouldn't have had the water treatment systems that we had in the past. So our current water mains and supply lines would have been natural rivers.
Okay, so the first relation we're going to talk about is in wetlands, and specifically cattails. So the soil in wetland is poor draining loam, and loam just means that there's almost an even mix of sand, silt, and clay. So it's like the perfect proportion, best for, I think gardeners love it. It's really good. And then water. So not too much, but oftentimes wetlands are saturated, which means that there's kind of always water in the soil. But the cattails, I think they can only take like a meter of water or something like that. So they don't love a ton of it. And then in terms of relationships with animals, dragonflies, they're little nymphs or they're little babies, live in the waters. So they use the cattail roots for protection and to kind of hide, as well as the adults. They would be able to hide in these cattails. There is a species of spider called sac spider that nests in leaves, and it actually makes this really cool, like triangular, almost tent. It like takes the leaf and like folds up three of the corners to make a little tent and a little nest for itself. And then another, this is a vertebrate species that relies on cattails, is muskrats. So muskrats, they rely on reeds like cattails for food. It's their main food source.
So here's kind of like, so just for folks who might not be familiar with cattails, well, these are actually cattails that have gone to seed.
Yes.
But
They're
cattails,
like hot dogs on a stick.
yeah, but so they're like a tall, reedy plant that often define wetlands. In High Park, this is High Park. This is Grenadier.
I would like this is Grenadier Pond South End.
So our wetlands would have been dominated by cattail marshes. That would have been the dominant plant species, the dominant wetland species that we would have had along the shorelines in High Park. And the species here that are mentioned are ones that are, you can kind of see the relationship that cattails automatically has because we have a soil environment that doesn't allow the water to drain, that allow the cattails to have what they need from like a rooting perspective, a water perspective. And then the cattails create a structure, create an environment that allow for invertebrates and vertebrates like our muskrats to survive. So we're going to go through the different ecosystems with that in mind. Talk about the environment, talk about some of the key plants, and then the relationship that those plants have on larger organisms, and in which these are all critters that we'll see here in Hyde Park. The sac spiders are difficult to see, but the other guys are larger and we'll be able to find likely.
Yeah, I've seen the muskrat.
Yeah, we've seen
recently.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
Good. Cool. All right. So this is like our wetland environment that we have here.
Yeah. And then here we're mentioning just microclimates. Yeah. So a microclimate is the climate of a very small or restricted area, especially when it differs from that of the surrounding area.
Yeah.
And we're talking specifically about ravines, which are where most of our forest ecosystems are, kind of on those slopes of ravines. And the microclimate there would be low sunlight, because of course you're in a valley with a bunch of trees, wet, loamy soils, that closed tree canopy, and cooler temperatures because of that low sunlight and higher moisture.
Yeah. Anyone who stepped into a ravine in this. Okay, so just going back to wetlands. So this is Grenadier, just so we can all see what we're talking about. So this is Grenadier Pond. In the foreground of this picture, those like sticks with fluffiness on it, those are cattails that have gone to seed. And these are also, we talked before about how they relate as like a shelter, which is required for our friends, our little nymphs, our dragonfly nymphs, and also a food source for our muskrats, which are animals that we have here in Hyde Park. And then we have, so this is our back, sorry, again, like this going back to the ravine, just want to make sure everyone saw what a cattail looked like and what Grenadier Pond looks like. But going back to this, so talking about our key tree that we have here in our ravines and we don't really see anywhere else is the cedar.
Is the cedar. Yeah, so they love having what we call wet feet. So they don't mind that saturated soil. They won't like kind of drown in it. And their roots help to stabilize those slopes that happen in ravines.
Yeah.
They've got really dense canopies because they're a conifer, but they've got like really broad coniferous leaves. They're kind of like flat and scaly. And they're also adapted to lower light conditions. I find the conifers are they don't they don't mind not having
Yeah.
a ton of light, so it's great for them to be in a valley.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then this is a picture of a ravine. Unfortunately, I literally couldn't find a picture of a ravine with cedars in it.
We have some here.
I can't explain why. Like I Googled so much, but this is just kind of an example of a ravine.
Yeah, and we do have our ravines here in High Park just down the slope does have some cedars in it. So we'll take you to see some when you're here on Thursday. And cedars are incredibly valuable for the ecosystem and also for first settler Europeans and indigenous communities. So in many traditions, they're known as grandmother cedar. They were like the overseer of the environment. And when Jacques Cartier rocked up and settled in North America, it was the tree of life for their
They
crew.
had scurvy, didn't they?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So after their long voyage and not having any fresh vegetables, they developed scurvy. And when you boil conifers, in particular cedar, it releases a lot of vitamin C into the teeth and is actually incredibly helpful as a medicinal purpose. And they're also incredibly valuable. Many cedars are a great refuge for migrating birds. Lots of birds nest inside them, and lots of animals will eat the young cedar shoots as well. They do have small cones on them, so they're not as teeny tiny. There are lots of birds that will eat those, but again, it's not like a pine cone that has like some really pine nuts are from pine cones, and they have like really meaty nuts that have lots of fats, but they're still consumed by lots of different animals. They're kind of valuable for different ecosystems. We just have a note in the chat.
You can eat cedar.
You can eat cedar, yeah.
You can eat spruce tips.
Yeah, a lot of
You can make soda out of pine needles. One of my friends in college did that.
Yeah. That being said, be very mindful of where you are foraging. A couple, like we don't, just to be very clear, like
don't forage in the park.
We do not forage in High Park. There's a couple different practices that people will ascribe to us. We know that this space is incredibly important to a lot of different wildlife, and there's limited options for that in High Park. So we want to give as much food resources to those plants and animals as we possibly can. So if you do forage off of wild trees, just be sure to like make sure you're allowed to do it in that area and that the trees themselves are safe to harvest from. They aren't sprayed with pesticides or any other chemicals that could be harmful for human health. With that in mind, because I know we were talking about food sources, so I just want to make sure that we're all safe and all on the same page when it comes to that. And our last ecosystem, okay.
There we go.
Yeah.
The black oak savanna. So they've got, of course, that sandy, well-draining soil, and of course the black oak trees, which are a keystone species. And to explain a keystone species, you think of the keystone in a bridge. It's the one that holds the whole bridge together, and if you pull it out, everything will collapse. So that's what the black oak is to these ecosystems. If we took away the black oak trees, we would not have a black oak savanna anymore. The animals that rely on it would all vanish, and we would be very, very sad.
Yeah, so we mentioned earlier that black oaks, along with cherries, our native cherry trees, those are often found in our forest ecosystems. They support up to 400 invertebrates, which is a huge diversity of species. There was a group working in High Park that were counting the number of different moss species, and they were able to reach 1,000, which is pretty impressive. So if we go back again to like our little like food web, those invertebrates are the foundation. When we don't have that foundation, when we don't have those invertebrates, it does make it challenging for all those organisms above them to find the food that they need. Well, so like Katy was saying, it's like the smut, like before a moth is a moth, it is a caterpillar. So that was likely a larger infestation of the spongy moths that existed. But there are a whole variety of different moths that
the eastern tent caterpillar, fall webworm, depending on the time of year that you saw them. Because the spongy moths are most active in the summer. Fall webworms towards late summer, early fall. 10 caterpillars, I believe, are out right now.
Yeah, and they're like, just to be clear, there are like 3,000 species of caterpillar in Ontario, and about
Yeah.
about 1,000 have been spotted in
In
High
the
Park.
park.
So it's like really, really tricky to know precisely which one because there
Unless
are
you had
thousands
one.
of them. And the interesting thing too about caterpillars and moths is that the caterpillars themselves, as they go through different stages, can look very different.
Yeah.
They're called instars. So many caterpillars, from like when it hatches to like when it before it goes into its cocoon.
Like 5 instars or something.
They-
5 different forms.
Yeah, and they can look entirely different every single time. So it's really tricky. But they're very interesting to look at for sure.
So bats are endangered. Well, not all of them, but there are 4, I believe, 4 species that are endangered. The little brown myotis, the big brown myotis, the tricolored bat, and one more that I always forget the name of.
The northern mitosis.
The northern myotis. And they're endangered because of something called white nose disease.
Right.
Or white nose fungus. And so they're all very colonial animals. They live in colonies in small caves. And that's how that fungus spreads, is through contact with the cave walls or infected bats. So like individuals can actually spread that fungus from like their original cave to wherever they migrate to, which could be like 1,000 kilometers away. And then they'll touch that and they'll spread this.
Is that it gets spread to their hibernation colonies. And the challenging thing with that is that it's a fungus. Funguses are very difficult to eradicate because they are surprisingly comparable in DNA to like a lot of living things because they're like not really like a virus or not a bacteria. So you can't like vaccinate for them. You can't give them medicine. So the tricky thing, this is a fungus. How it interacts with bats is it starts to irritate them.
It grows on their nose,
grows
their mucous membrane.
Yeah, and it wakes them up. And then when they wake up from that hibernation, it depletes their energy stores and they can't make it through the winter. So there are a few what is starting to happen now is they're seeing some bats develop a better resiliency to it. That goes back to when we were talking earlier about that genetic diversity. There are going to be individuals that will survive these types of things better than other individuals. When they do survive, they'll pass those genes, those characteristics on to the next generation, which will hopefully improve it. The tricky thing is that you can't go in and treat these caves once they become infected. The best way to kind of mitigate it is to avoid disturbing bats as much as possible and avoid visiting caves where you could potentially introduce that type of fungus to it that hasn't been infected before. But again, it's really, really challenging to manage for that. You can. Some of the bats would be hibernating further south. Some of them do migrate further south. Some of them would likely hibernate in some of those caves.
Yeah, like you can't tell from the outside if the bats inside of the cave are infected. It just kind of looks like a cave.
Yeah, which is tricky.
It is. And it's especially tricky because I think they found that like the fungus can exist like residually on cave walls for like 4 or 5 years. Without like dying or going away. So it's really rough.
Yeah. So bat boxes aren't used for hibernating. They're used as a roost for when like the bat life cycle, they hibernate in specific caves. Especially so this is different depending on where you are. Bats have different adaptations. Like if you've been to the bat cave at the ROM, very different vibes to bats here in Canada. So those bats at the ROM bat cave, they're typically breeding and roosting and raising their kids in this
basically everything
out of that same cave. Whereas like bats here have a roosting site where they will raise their children. They'll raise their children. Yeah. And absolutely, that could
anywhere.
Be in barns. Depending on the bat species, it's also going to depend, but you could be in a barn, an old house. Sometimes it happens in industrial facilities that have long been abandoned. Bat boxes are another introduced space that bats can roost in. Natural spaces that they'll roost in are hollow trees. Some bats will actually roost just underneath like thick branches. So it really depends on the bat species. And then when they go to hibernate, some bats will actually migrate and go to other areas. Some bats will hibernate in local-ish caves as well. So like this bat fungus was actually introduced first to a cave in New York.
Yeah.
And then it's eventually spread through bats coming in contact with each other and also people going into caves and then bringing that fungus with them, bringing the spores of those funguses, and then reintroduce them to other caves as well.
Originated in the States.
Well, it originated in Europe.
Well, yeah.
And then was brought to North America.
Okay.
And then it was first found in a cave in New York. And then it has kind of spread to other different caves.
Spread really fast, really.
But there's lots of other ways that we can help bats. And some of those ways to help bats would be making sure that we have habitat for them when it comes to natural spaces for roosting and also habitat for the insects that they need to eat. So that could be planting native plants where you can, supporting endeavors to help rewild or restore spaces. So like here in Hyde Park, we're looking at converting some spaces that have been traditionally mostly turf grass into spaces that are going to support more of those species. And even just adding, like we were saying before, black oaks being a tree on its own that supports, hundreds of different species, making choices in like, rather than planting a Norway maple, planting something that's kind of more of a keystone species can also help with that as well too. So making sure that they're set up for success when they go to hibernate. They have really strong energy stores. They're more likely to get through the winter. I think, or for an urban environment, when you're kind of converting it over to a residential space, the soil itself is fast draining because it is made of sand.
But lets the water drain through. So it's the water that's draining, not the soil.
Not the soil. Like the soil itself, the structure of it allows for water to drain out of it. And it's important because there are plants and animals that need to have fast draining soil. They like to have their roots in sandy soil that allows for the water to come through. And the reason why it just drains quickly is that sand has very, very big, they're big sizes compared to
relatively big compared to like clay
and silt. When you have lots of air pockets between large soil particles, it allows for the water to move through it quickly compared to somewhere where it's really, really tight spaces and it takes a lot longer to drain out. So when you have those types of ecosystems that are fast draining, you have plants that are like our savanna plants that have really, really long, complex root systems and that have a desire and a need to have dry roots. They don't need a lot of water. Kind of like we think about like an extreme example would be if you go to the Alberta Badlands, even though it's Alberta, you can still find cacti there because it's a very dry ecosystem, even though it does get cold and snowy in the winter. But that's the same thing here. Like we have spaces in the park that has fast draining soil. And that supports a hugely complex ecosystem. Like we have lots of rare plants in that space. We have lots of, I think we have about 80 rare plants here in Hyde Park. That is a mix between our savanna ecosystems and also our more ravine spaces where it's a little bit drier and a little bit wetter. But we also have lots of insects that require that dry soil. Some of those being ground nesting bees, like our cellophane bees. We also have some ground nesting wasps as well that need that kind of drier space too. And we also have lots of different smaller mammals that would be burrowing in those drier spaces. We also have lots of rabbits as well that kind of like make use of those spaces to create their nests as well above ground, but still because it's a drier environment, makes it a little bit easier for them to raise their young. And great grazing habitat for every now and again, we do get deer in the park, which is pretty impressive. And they do like, because that diversity of grasses that are present in that space, we'll take advantage of that too.
I do like this point about plants being important for soil by rain. Yeah. Because the savanna plants, they do have those deep roots. They actually, they help hold the soil together and maybe hold a little bit more of that moisture. So the black oak savanna is not actually a forest ecosystem.
No, it's a savanna
ecosystem. So the savanna would not be relevant to Canada's forestry industry at all.
No.
We wouldn't be harvesting trees from it or anything because it's not a forest.
No. Traditionally in the past, like it would have been valuable timber for specific things like it's easy land to clear because you'll be able to open up a space very, very quickly. There's only about 20% canopy cover, so it's a very open environment. It's great to convert from a savanna into an agricultural space. You can also use the very few trees that you have to build things like houses because it's oaks and they're strong. But the forest industry wouldn't be developing a savanna space. They're more focused on something that would have high tree density, lots of trees that they can cut down in a short amount of time to get as much money as they can out of it. And that's not a savanna ecosystem at all.
So we mentioned our savanna plants. So our tall grasses, perennial flowers, what are especially our perennial flowers would support our insects like butterflies and moths. The dragonflies less live on the plants and more just kind of hunt for the other insects that are living, almost like the bats do. The bats feed on the insects in the savanna, so do the dragonflies. They don't live up there, they would live in the wetland.
Yeah.
There we go. And here's just a picture of, I don't actually know if this is the tableland savanna, but here's the picture of the black oak savanna in High Park.
Yeah, so you can see here we don't have, like, if we look back at, like, to be fair, this is taken at a different time of year versus our ravine picture, but you can see that there's much more space between those trees. That allows for a lot of sunlight to get down to the soil, to keep the soil really warm, and to make sure that we have lots of sun-loving understory plants thriving.
And now the biodiversity challenge of being in Toronto.
Yeah.
But so High Park is a massive park in the middle of a massive city.
Yeah.
And we need to be able to balance our recreational needs of, like, you know, our soccer fields and our swimming pools and our turf grass to have picnics on with the existing biodiversity. So yeah, as I said, pockets of ecosystems, as you saw on our map of High Park where there's ravines and stuff, are broken up by large turf grass lawns and paved walkways, which makes it a little tricky. There we go. So that's where we get a lot of overlapping ecosystems or ecotones. So an ecotone is a transitional area between two different, usually plant communities, because it's the easiest way to determine what ecosystem you're in. So these areas are used in different ways by different species and will often contain species that you can't find in the overlapping communities. So I used an example of marshlands. So wetlands are really good examples of ecotones because you're transitioning from your terrestrial forest, meadow, whatever it is on land into your aquatic water ecosystem. So wetlands are habitat for several invertebrate species at risk, such as several species of dragonflies. Actually, I think those are the biggest ones. Yeah, dragonflies are the biggest ones that are at risk. So the Hines emerald dragonfly and stuff like that. And then cattails, which are the primary food source of muskrats, which you wouldn't find up in a forest and you wouldn't find out in, like, the middle of Lake Ontario. And the cool thing about the muskrats is that if they cannot find enough cattails down by the water, they'll actually walk up into either the forest or the savanna to look for acorns or other seeds that they can eat. So they live in the ecotone, but they use both systems. They swim in the water and they come up on land to find food occasionally.
Yeah, so kind of going back into the comment earlier, when we have like that abundance of species, lots of diversity in one place, animals that need to have those like primary needs met, like finding food sources, spaces to breed and shelter, they're more likely to find that because they have lots of different options to them. They're not just stuck with like one solution that they need to follow. They can go basically just a hop, skip, and the jump, go over to the next ecosystem, grab what they need, and maybe head back to like where they find themselves most comfortable.
And now this is just kind of a recap of the overall biodiversity in High Park. I know it's a lot of words, but it's basically just showing you how many different species of animals you can find. So more than 150 bird species are seen regular. I believe almost 400 species have been recorded.
260.
Okay, there we go. Almost 300. I couldn't remember. Okay. Almost 300 bird species have been recorded kind of throughout all the time in High Park. There are 18 species of mammal, 9 amphibian and reptile species, or herps as we call them, 12 fish species, I believe two of which, or three, are invasive. So the carp, the bluegill sunfish, and there's one more that I can't remember. Yes, the goldfish. The introduced goldfish. There's 74 butterfly species, and as Aira said earlier, over 1,000 species of moth, which is super crazy.
Yeah. So there's again, 400-acre park, but we're still counting like thousands of species. And this is just the wildlife. When we start looking at the plant community as well,
crazy.
80 rare plants. Some of those are going to be in our wetland environments. Some of those are going to be in our savanna environments. I don't think we even mentioned this fact, but of all the different patches of savanna that are currently left in Ontario from a pre-colonial time, it's believed that there's only about 2%, and the fourth largest one in the entire province is found here in High Park. And we're in the middle of a city.
Yeah.
But we still have these patches of a remaining ecosystem type that is globally rare. Very little of it remains. And we have a significant portion of it here in High Park, which is pretty cool. Yeah.
So this is just recapping what we talked about in kind of the section of High Park. So there's 3 ecosystems. Soils influence plants, which influence animals. And then just kind of wetland soils are loamy, poorly draining, which means that the plants need to like them. They need to be really into that. Microclimates are specific to very small, restricted areas that are different from those around it. And savanna soils are typically sandy, well-draining, which means the plants need to be drought resistant.
Yeah. All right.
I think the next thing is a quiz, but I don't know if we
I am just going to hop in here. Okay, cool. Talk a little bit more about what we wanted to do on like considering risks to biodiversity, how we can help ecosystems. So we're going to go through this fairly quickly because we know we are at time.
Yeah, I do believe. Okay, there we go.
Okay, so if we look at this is kind of like traditional what you would see when you look at a lot of Toronto trails.
Like an entrance to a ravine.
Exactly, yeah. It's lush, it's green, it's beautiful. So you think looking at this like, oh, this is going to be a very, very healthy ecosystem. But regrettably, it's not. One of the biggest challenges within the Toronto ravine systems is that there are a lot of introduced species from away that don't have that same relationship with our native invertebrates, our species that are typically in those lower levels, those primary consumer levels of that food web. And it actually leads to something becoming ecologically dead. It can't support those complex relationships that we have between plants, primary consumers, secondary consumers, and so on. So you don't have, there's a richness of species, there's lots of species here, but oftentimes it might not necessarily be the species that's needed to support further levels in the food web. So there's a lot that has been lost. Obviously, we looked at those rivers. We've lost a lot of species. Of all the provinces, Ontario has the highest number of extirpated and extinct and historical species of any area in Canada. But what can we do? So High Park is actually a great story when it comes to restoration and particularly community-led restoration. So in the park here, we have what's called wild blue lupins. They are a indicator species of the savanna ecosystems. They are typically in dry areas, open areas, lots of suns, and they were last really seen in Southern Ontario. Oh nope, this is specifically the carnival butterfly. They haven't really been as present because we've had a big reduction in those spaces for the savanna ecosystems. So here in High Park, we had a gentleman who was a botanist spot some. And when they noticed that, they realized this space in High Park was traditionally a savanna ecosystem. And then the city, led and encouraged by the community, started to work on restoring the tableland savanna, which is just behind the Grenadier Cafe if you have been to High Park before. And these plants here are also host plants for the Carner blue butterfly, which are a native butterfly here, but have been extirpated. Extirpated meaning that they still exist within the world, but they no longer exist within this certain range. Grenadier Pond is another example of community-led restoration within the park. So in the mid-90s, they actually worked towards removing the concrete slab around the shoreline. And that naturalization led to more of the wetland that Katy spoke about earlier. So that would, you want to take that on? Do you want to present that? Your restoration of the wetlands? So that kind of goes right back into the cattail marsh that we were looking at before. So that space where those cattails are would have been where that concrete shoreline existed, those didn't exist. So without them, we wouldn't have had the dragonflies that we do today. We wouldn't have had the food sources for the muskrats that we do today. We wouldn't have that shelter spaces for the fishes that are breeding in the park. And we also wouldn't have that restored shoreline where it's a lot more stable compared to what it would have been with that concrete barrier. So there's lots that has been done, and there's lots more that is still happening, including the return of fires. So again, back to that big community push to restore those natural spaces within the 90s, another activity was the reintroduction of fire in Hyde Park. So we cast our minds back to when Katy presented about the different types of successional forests. We were talking about disturbances on the land that are fire-based, fire-related. Fire helps clear a space so that rather than having that successional forest occur, you have a savanna grassland ecosystem that continues to exist. So traditionally, it would have been done by the indigenous people to help maintain this type of ecosystem. It also would have been triggered by fires with the introduction of European settlement. Fires on the land were suppressed, so that would have led to that would have led to those spaces no longer having fire. So you would have seen a successional forest occur. So you start to see those pioneer species like aspen move in, like ash move in, poplars come in, fill up a space, create that shade. Now with fire, we're constantly having that regenerative experience occur. So that allows for species that are fire dependent, like the jack pine that we talked about before, like some of our oak trees, exist and recur naturally rather than them being planted. So it's a pretty special restorative process that occurs today. And again, all community led.
Because we can just go into, yeah.
Yeah. So, Katy, take it away.
So these are some low or no cost ways that are very, very easy to help Toronto biodiversity. First one, keep your dog on a leash, unless you're in like a kind of designated dog park area. It's best to keep them on leash. They won't go trampling all the plants and all of that. Along with that, staying on designated trails when in parks. Again, you don't want to trample all the plants. You also don't want to get poison ivy or anything like that.
Yeah.
This one's for at home. Limit outdoor lighting, install timers or motion sensors, and close curtains after sunset, which is mostly for birds and also bugs. If you don't like having bugs around your house, turn off your outside lights and they'll probably go away. Pack low or no litter lunches and snacks when visiting parks. I always say pack in, pack out. What you bring into the park, you should bring out with you. Choosing native plants for your gardens, even container gardens, because the invertebrate species or even the birds that will come up to those plants have grown up with native plants, and that's great. They love that. And then the last, which is really, really easy, just talking about how interesting and diverse Toronto's ecology is with other people. Education is the best way to kind of get people thinking about how to help biodiversity. Because if they don't know what biodiversity is, they don't know how to help, and they don't really care about helping if they don't know about Toronto's biodiversity.
Cool. Oh, and lastly, these are just some teachings that we always like to consider here at the Nature Center when we talk about ecology and when we think about what goes into like a lesson plan. If on the right of the screen here, we have a wampum belt. Wampum belts were how the indigenous people would create their treaties and communicate their treaties to folks within their community. This is the dish with one spoon wampum. This area here would have been a meeting place for many different communities, and to help them stay in agreement, they created this wampum belt for the dish with one spoon. It represents how they would all agree to use the land. So they treat it as though it's a dish with one spoon. Everyone needs to be able to eat from the land, be able to get the resources that they need. So they're just eating with one spoon. They're also agreeing to keep the space as clean as possible. No one is taking more than what they need. And they're making sure that there's enough for everyone to share. And they're also making sure that the dishes are staying clean. So basically kind of like how you would like act at a guest house as an example. Another one that I've personally received from some of my elders and my peers is that when we think about how we're using the spaces around us, nothing belongs to us here. We're just borrowing it from our children. So trying to think about the next generation. Many Indigenous cultures often think of like 7 generations when it comes to how they use the space. And the last one, often influenced by Robin Wall Kimmerer and her book Braiding Sweetgrass. If you have a chance to read it, I highly recommend it. It's about living in reciprocity with all of our relations. So when we go out into the park, we always think about what we're getting from the land. And that can be something that's very much like not necessarily a tangible item, but just the emotional and spiritual benefit of it. Every time we move into the space, we are going to have some impact on what's around us. But how can we give back and how can we limit that so that we're getting something from the land and we're also giving something back to the land? Kind of like a sharing relationship, yeah, in a degree. And yeah, so that's, I know that was a lot. We kind of went through those last 2 slides very quickly. Again, my apologies. But yeah, so Toronto is nature. We're a part of it. We're not separate from it. And it's an incredibly, if we go back to like slide number 1, it is the most biodiverse city in Canada. So it's an incredibly special place that we live here.